take it by experience. But the last by experience thing went away in the mid-90s.
Right.
So,
Yeah, because I know a person that he's decided just because of the experience, he took the exam and...
I was.
Oh, you
Yeah,
were?
in 95.
yeah, it was. I think 95 was about the last.
I mean, I did a lot, but
yeah.
but I didn't do a formal fellowship, even though my fellowship did blend cytology and surgical pathology together.
Right.
So I guess for the lifetime people, you should, like, I am from California, watch and wait very carefully, basically.
Yeah.
I'm not going to jump, basically re-register, but I may very well have to do so in the next year
I
or
think
two.
you probably will.
Yeah.
I think you're almost, the board does not ever intend to make you do it, but other people, other agencies are going to.
Yeah, but you're saying that there's a 10-year once you register, so there's probably no reason to do it until California starts requiring it. So, okay. So,
ABMS would shoot me for saying that, but no.
okay. No, that's why I went to this meeting to just see when and
right.
if. Okay. Thank you.
Some,
Just keep an eye out, yeah.
morning. Some of us would came especially to meet with you.
Oh,
This
okay.
morning. Okay. I did my APFB 0708,
Okay.
and I rushed in just putting my SAMs and CME last year. It should be 2012. Does it make a difference? Like I combined 07 and 08. 07 AP, 08 FB. So combination means go backwards to 07 or
Right. You have to go back to 07.
So I have to report this year, although I did that last year, everything. I did that earlier.
Okay. I tell you, you probably don't, but check with Mary. Email Mary
Okay.
at mary@abpath.org
Okay.
and ask her that question, because she has all of the records and she can absolutely look and see what we have and what you have to do.
Okay, last thing, we are not name accredited and I work for the state.
Right.
So what else can satisfy that one, apart from check sample, which I use that for my CME
If you have something like a pending case conference, if you review...
with my colleagues? Okay.
Or if you have a review of interesting cases or anything like that, you can fill out a form and send it in and we'll accept
Okay, what about the state lab, crime lab? It is ISCALAD approved. Can I put that number, ASCLAD? At the time it worked, and I asked them over the phone 2 years ago.
Probably.
They said,
Probably
give us
for
a number,
yeah.
because we are not name accredited.
Yeah,
Number
sure,
of cases.
that would probably be all right.
Yeah, pleasure meeting you,
Nice
Doctor.
to meet you
Thank
too.
you.
That 80% rule of the area of your practice, if you come to a meeting like this, for example, and there are all kinds of things,
It's all right.
it's fine, as long as it's pathology related, even if you're mostly doing like
Doesn't make
derm
any difference.
paths,
Probably if you've got a general certificate in AP, it applies. Okay.
How many CMEs do you have to report? Like I got my initial certificate in 2010, then did a HIMPA fellowship 2011. So how many CMEs?
If you did you don't have to report anything the first time. You just say you check the box that said I did a fellowship, and that covers you for the first 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
The sessions are being recorded, so
I need to
they're
repeat the
asking,
questions.
actually,
sorry.
they're asking if you can use the mouse for the pointer. Moving
Oh,
the
okay.
pointer with the mouse
Okay.
instead of using the...
Haven't been using the pointer at all.
They
Okay.
can't record the laser
Okay, got
the
it.
way they're doing it.
Okay, no
So
problem.
if you could do that, that'd be great.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
So, okay, good morning. I think in the interest of fairness, I should disclose that the topic of this is what you need to know for the APCP boards. I did not bring the answers to next year's exam. So if that's what you were expecting and you want to leave, I understand. Go ahead. But it's very hard when you're given a topic that says, what do you need to know or how do you prepare for the board? Because everybody prepares a little differently, and what works for me isn't necessarily going to work for you. But what I'm trying to do in this hour is to tell you a little bit, give you a little bit more information about the board than you may have, and sort of give you a take on what I see as some of the techniques that people can use, or the resources that people can go to help them when you get ready to take the board. So the first thing you need to know about the board exam is that it's only part of the requirements for certification. Everybody gets all agitated about it, and probably rightfully so. But you do need to remember that you have to have a full and unrestricted license to practice medicine in a state or of the U.S. or the province of Canada. And you have to have completed whatever the training requirement is for the area of pathology that you wish to become certified in. Okay, so I'm not going to go over those now because we're supposed to be talking about the exam. But I think it is important to remind people that passing the exam alone will not get you a certificate. All right? If you don't have your license yet, you can, for APCP, we will let you go ahead and sit for the exam, but you can't get your results until we see your license. And we actually have people that took the exam a while back and have never gotten their results because they never sent us a license. And now we have a rule that says if we don't get your license within 2 years, then that exam is voided and you have to take it again. So you'll never know whether you passed it or not if you don't tell us within 2 years. You just have to start over, okay? So it's only part of what's required. So having said that, now let's think about what the purpose of the exam is. And the purpose of this exam is really to demonstrate that someone has sufficient knowledge in a particular area of pathology, AP, CP, both, a subspecialty, if we will. I'm not really talking about subspecialties today, to practice competently and independently. And this is only, it's only a part of that assessment. You know, we're talking about an exam that is given at a particular time on a particular day, and there's a certain amount of statistical uncertainty with all of the results. I mean, we all know there's a margin of error in the grading, and that, you know, if you have a score that's within a certain area, you could probably take it again the next day, and it would be either higher or lower than what it is today. So we also rely on the program directors and to give us a statement that in the opinion of the faculty of your training program, you're able to practice competently and independently. So that sort of goes along with the test result in order to allow us to make that judgment. And the exam is pass-fail, all right? For that reason, if you fail the exam, you will get a report from us that tells you how you sort of performed, whether it was upper, middle, or lower third in various areas of the exam. If you passed it, you don't get that report, and you don't get your scaled score. If you fail it, you get the scaled score, and then you get the areas that you did well and did poorly in. If you pass it, you don't get your score, because this exam is not designed to say, if I made this score, I'm obviously smarter than the person who made this score, and I should get this job instead of that other person, okay? You all know how the USMLE exam scores have sort of gotten corrupted in terms of, you know, they're designed to do the same thing. They're pass-fail too, okay? But we all know that if you've got a better score on your USMLE exams and that's reported, that gets looked at in a different way. So we don't want to do that. If you pass the exam, all you know is you passed the exam. You don't know whether you passed it at the top or you barely passed it. And for our purposes, you know, it's like you passed, okay? So what do the ABP exams cover? And there's a couple of different ways you can look at this. AP, you can look at it in terms of covering general pathology, which would be the first 10 chapters of Robbins: inflammation, repair, neoplasia, circulation, etc. Systemic pathology, or laboratory management, Or you could look at AP as covering autopsy and forensic pathology, surgical path, cytopath, and laboratory management, with all of the other AP sort of subspecialty areas rolled into surgical path or autopsy path. CP is a little easier to break down, and we break it down into these general areas: blood banking, transfusion medicine, chemical pathology, hematology, medical microbiology, laboratory management. Okay, so let's go back a minute. if you take the AP exam, do you have to pass each of these areas separately? No, you do not. You have to have an overall pass rate, overall passing score, okay? You can do less well in cytopath and do very well in surge path and probably make up for the difference, okay? Same thing holds true for clinical path. You don't have to pass hematology, microbiology, chemistry individually in order to pass this exam. They're all graded together. You have an overall pass rate. So what do these exams do? What do they cover? You all are probably familiar with the concept of the general competencies that were developed by ACGME, and which medical education is supposed to be based upon now. Patient care, medical knowledge, practice-based learning and improvement, interpersonal and communication skills, professionalism, systems-based practice. Well, our exam actually covers relatively few of these areas, okay? Based upon, we assess medical knowledge and how you apply it to patient care, and we feel pretty good about that. Our management questions, to some extent, evaluate systems-based practice. I have a pretty good idea, based upon the phone calls that we get in the office, about interpersonal and communication skills and professionalism, but I don't have a real grade for that, so that's not really included, okay? So the exam covers these areas. We would like to be able to cover some of the others, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out a way to do that in the future. But for right now, it's pretty much concentrated on these three that I have checked. So how does the exam relate to practice? Well, it depends on who you ask. One of the very common comments that we get from a resident is, this has no relationship to practice whatsoever. Now, considering that most people who say this are still in their residency and all they've seen is their own academic practice, I'm not totally sure how they know that. But that we do get a lot of comments that say it's absolutely nothing to do with practice. The test committee members, on the other hand, who write the questions, feel like that it actually relates very well to practice. So it's all in your perspective, I guess. We try not to ask too many really esoteric questions, although, again, depending on who you ask, the candidates would say that there are a number of them on there that one is not likely to run into in your average practice in your average place. It's interesting, again, your perspective, because I'm APCP certified. I do not have a fellowship in anything, all right? I practiced predominantly CP for most of my career. I was a laboratory director. And so when I look at the CP exam, it all looks very relevant to me because I did all of that stuff. And I'll look at the AP exam and I'll think, well, that's kind of a weird tumor, I don't know. But then the AP people will say, oh, no, they really need to know that. So, it's all in your perspective, all right? So we try to make it relevant. It isn't really honestly done to torture people, although I think that's a common fallacy that we lay awake at nights trying to figure out ways that we can make the exam worse so everybody can get a little more upset about it. The questions for the exam are developed by test development and advisory committees, and we have 12 of those. One of them is new. The Lab Management Committee is actually meeting for its first time in November. Prior to that, the management questions have been written in amongst questions for the other committees, and we decided that probably wasn't working as well as it should. So we now have a committee that's going to be doing these areas. Okay, AP obviously does the AP questions for the AP exam. Blood banking, chemical path, cytopath, forensic path, heme, management, microbiology, microbiology and neuropath. No, microbiology, stop with that. Those committees write questions for both the general APCP exam and the subspecialty exams. The DERM committee, the molecular genetic pathology committee, the neuropath committee, and the pediatric path committee write questions only for subspecialties. Okay? The DERM committee is a joint committee with the American Board of Dermatology. Molecular genetic path is a joint committee with Genetics, American Board of Medical Genetics. And there will be another committee that will be formed this year on clinical informatics, which is a newly approved subspecialty that is jointly sponsored by the American Board of Preventive Medicine and the American Board of Pathology. So how are the exams developed? Test committees meet annually with each member submitting questions for review by the committee. The committee then goes over the questions, accepts a large part of them, rejects some of them. They view the images, so all of those fuzzy images that you guys complain about have been approved by some committee. Now, occasionally, I have to admit, the committee will go back and look and say, who approved that? And I say, you did last year, remember? And they go, oh, okay. Well, so every once in a while, something that's not quite so great gets through. But I think most of the images are not probably quite as bad as people might have you believe. If the question is approved, then it goes into the item bank. And then for the actual exam, one or more trustees select items from the item bank based on a blueprint for the exam. This is not, at the moment at least, a computer-generated exam. There's actually somebody or a group of people who put each exam together. Each exam has, the AP and the CP exams have both written and practical sections. For AP, the written questions, there are 141 of them, and you have a little, 2 hours and 15 minutes to answer those. For the images, there are 108. Don't ask me how these numbers ended up, but because they don't make a lot of sense. If you look at 141 and 108, that's sort of odd numbers, but they ended up that way because we kept mucking with the numbers, and that's how they came out. And then there are 75 microscopic or virtual images. At the moment, there are 50 glass slides and 25 virtual images. At some point, you can expect that that's going to go up again. As far as virtual goes. Everybody always wants to know when they can take the exam someplace besides Tampa, and part of the answer to that is as soon as the images are all virtual. And then people usually say, oh, well, never mind, I like Tampa just fine. Because it's like, my mother always used to tell me, be careful what you ask for. It's one of those deals. As soon as the images become all virtual, then we can probably start moving it to other places, not necessarily Sylvan Centers, because of the file size for these virtual questions is really huge, and you have to play around with what you can do. But we should be able to offer it at other sites as soon as everything goes all virtual. What's the content? People always ask me this, and so I don't want to get too caught up in this, but in general, the general path questions and the lab management questions for the AP exam are a relatively small part of the exam. They're only about 6% of the exam. And systemic pathology questions, as they might relate to either surg path, autopsy, forensic, whatever, would all fall into the systemic category. And if you look at the different topics, the ones that I have listed there account for 7 to 9% of the exam each. So if you multiply all that out, you can see that there are some areas that are covered a lot more than others. All right. The molecular questions are actually distributed throughout the exam. All right. There's not a defined molecular area, molecular topic. There may be molecular questions related to GI or female genital or respiratory or whatever. And then cytopath is about 16% of the 94%. Okay. And that is predominantly images. What kind of images can you expect to see on this exam? You may see images of gross specimens from surgical pathology or autopsy. You may see histopathologic specimens stained with a variety of different stains, including immunostains of all types, in which we generally will tell you what that is, unless that's part of the question. Electron micrographs are pretty much now limited to medical renal disease. We don't show much in the way of tumor EM. I don't think we show any tumor EMs anymore. Nobody does that. They do immunohistochemistry instead. But you still do have electron micrographs for medical renal disease. You may see karyotypes related to molecular issues. You may see pedigrees, various types of molecular path preparations, fish, lots, all kinds of those things. And then cytopath smears. Fine needle aspirates, and for the most part, liquid prep cytologies. We aren't showing pap smears anymore because most people aren't doing those very much. For CP, the written exam is 130 questions. It lasts about 2 hours. The practical exam in CP is also divided into 2 parts, one of which is images. That's the CP2 on here. And that's primarily hematology and microbiology. Okay? So you may think that, God, there's no hematology. And there probably is very little hematology if you're looking at what we call the written practical exam, because all the images in hematology and micro are on the second part of the test. Now, there are some questions, even though we call it practical with images. Since we've got all the hematology on there anyway, there are some things like interpretation of coag testing and things that might not have a digital image associated with it, but have an interpretation associated with it that would also be on that exam. So let's talk about the content here. And for CP, it breaks down pretty much about what you would think. Again, hematology is a little bit more than the others, but not a whole lot more. Chemistry probably is the least of the 4 major areas, and then management's about 10%. And again, molecular pathology is distributed throughout all the other categories: micro, hematology, chemistry, and blood bank. So the practical exam with images, as I said, is primarily hematology and microbiology. What's on here? Peripheral blood smears, bone marrow smears or sections, lymphoid tissue from various sites, platelet aggregation studies, microbiology plates, stains of different organisms, biochemical reactions, molecular pathology preparations. The rest of the practical exam in CP relates primarily to chemical path, blood bank, transfusion medicine, and laboratory management. So there are cell panels on there. There are calculations like you're going to buy a new machine for the lab. The cost of this, and this, and how many tests you have to do to make a profit or come out even or something like that. You may have to calculate that. There are graphs and charts for you to interpret immunopath tests such as ANAs, and again, molecular pathology preparations in these areas. Okay, I've said that you don't have to pass a particular area like chemistry of the blood bank exam individually, or of the CP exam individually. You pass the CP exam as a whole, but you do have to pass both the written and the practical parts of the examination in the same administration. Okay? So, if you pass the written but you don't pass the practical, that doesn't mean you get to come back and take just the practical. You have to take all of it again. And the reason for that is primarily statistical. And again, you know, as we all know, there is a certain amount of error around the measurements. If you talk about psychometrics, and I don't talk about it much because, as I tell everybody else, it's what I pay the psychometrician for, so whatever she tells me, I'll believe her pretty much. But it's very unusual that somebody would, say, end up with a scale score of 498 on the practical exam and have a 600 score on the written. All right? You know, you're usually looking at 498 and 501 or something like that. So that we feel like that the best assessment of someone's ability requires that they take the entire exam again. You can't just take the part that you failed. So all of the questions are multiple choice. They're all in a one best answer format. Now, before I get into how to prepare for the exam, one thing that I think I told you we were trying to come up with a way to test some things besides just medical knowledge and patient care issues. And we've been looking at trying to develop some more interactive types of questions on the exam. And I think that we will probably in 2012 have a couple of questions or a series of questions on the exam that will not count and which may be voluntary because I can't quite figure out how to do the time assessment. But if so, they'll be like at the end of the day or something. But where you get, for example, let's use surgical pathology, and you get a piece of tissue to look at, and they say, okay, this comes, and you've got this history. This is what the specimen looked like grossly. This is what it looks like under the microscope. What's your differential diagnosis on this? So then you'll have a list of things that you can pick from for your differential diagnosis. Okay. Some of them you get positive credit for. If it was something that was totally ridiculous, you might get negative credit for it. Some of them you might not get, it might be neutral, plus minus. Okay, then the next question is going to be, what are you going to order? What stains are you going to order to evaluate the specimen? So then you go in and say, okay, I want this, 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 and this. And then you get the results back of what you ordered. You get to see the slide with the stain of what you ordered. And you go, I should have ordered something else. So you get one chance to go back and get an additional stain or two. Right? So then you go through. And again, it's like, writing these questions is really fun. Figuring out how to grade them is the hard part. Where you get, okay, some of them are good. You get, if you're really on the right track, you get and it's perfectly logical that you would do this, you get a positive point for it. If it's something that's totally ridiculous, you would get a negative for it. Or some of them, it might not really make that much difference whether you order it or not. And so that's just neutral. You don't get any points, plus or minus, for that. So then the last question would be, okay, based upon all the results of this, now what do you think is the diagnosis? Okay. So the idea behind that would be that it would test some degree of judgment and decision-making besides just direct knowledge. It would probably also be more fun to take, but that's another issue. So if we can figure out how to do it, we may have one question series on the exam in 2012 that, as I say, would not count and would probably be voluntary and add an additional few minutes to the exam because we're not totally sure how long it would take the average person to go through that question, and that's part of what we're trying to figure out by offering it. So I don't really know how much time I would need to take off of some other category in order to keep the exam the same length. So what I suspect we'll do is have some kind of say, we would really appreciate it if you would help us evaluate this question, and you need to stay 20 minutes longer than you would have otherwise. That's not for sure, but we're thinking about doing something like that in 2012. Okay, so now this is what you all came in here for, right? How to prepare for the board exam. And most of this is going to sound like, as someone once used the word platitudinous, all right, which I don't think is really a word, but there's not going to be anything here that you haven't heard before, I don't think, because I really don't believe that I have come up with some really wonderful, unique way to tell everybody how to prepare for the board exam. But you do need to make the most of each rotation as you go through it. And that sounds like, well, obviously. But I think one of the things that people find a problem with clinical pathology in particular is that it is not possible anymore. Maybe you could have done it at one time. But it really isn't possible anymore to just read that in a book and understand it enough to answer questions on it. You really have to go in the lab and see what they're doing. There is no substitute for time spent in the laboratory in CP. You cannot read it enough to make sense out of it if you haven't seen it. I think that it's very interesting because the last year or two, people have done a little better on the CP exam than on the AP exam. And that happens every now and then people get overconfident in their CP teaching abilities, and it goes back to the other way around again. But I think one of the things that makes CP seem so much harder to you when you take it is that if you think about AP, it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about cyto or autopsy path or, forensic path, whatever. It's all coming off a common basis, which is histology. All right? The criteria for a malignant cell are the same in histopathology and cytopathology. They look a little different because of the way that you're viewing it, but they're all coming off of a histopathology type background. And if you learn histopath for surgpath, you've got a basis on which to go to cytopath. If you learn blood bank, that doesn't help you in microbiology. Okay? So you're looking at areas that have totally different backgrounds. Right? You don't have this common thread running through all of them in CP. And I think that's part of what makes it seem so much harder to people. And again, most pathologists are very visually oriented. You wouldn't be in pathology if you weren't visually oriented. And a lot of CP does not necessarily, off the top of your head, seem like it's geared toward being visually oriented. Well, the visually oriented part in CP is that you need to actually see it done. Okay? You cannot sit there and memorize a list of biochemical reactions in microbiology and have it make any sense to you and mean anything and think you're going to remember it if you've never actually looked at one in the lab. Okay? You can't you can read how you do a cell panel, all right? But if you've never done one, you can't just sit down. You're not going to just sit down and just flip through the first one that you come across on the exam. You really have to do these. And I think that while I'm giving a sermon here, I think it's very important that you actually get the experience, because that's the only way you can put your visual cortex, if you will, to work on something like that. You don't have a common background in CP to come off of. If you've never seen a malignant something or the other in cytopath, but you know the qualities of a malignant cell, you can probably tell it's malignant, right? If you've never seen that particular tumor before, you can still probably tell it's malignant because of the cytopathologic features. But you don't have that to help you out in CP. So make the most out of every rotation as you go through it. And then, give yourself a schedule. I think make yourself up a schedule several months in advance and try and figure out how much time you need to devote based on how much time you've got to the different areas. You know what you're good in and what you're not good in. If you are really a top-notch blood banker and you can do those cell panels in your sleep, don't spend 6 weeks studying blood bank, when you don't know anything about microbiology. You know where your strengths and your weaknesses are. And you need to play to your strength by not spending a whole lot. Review it. Certainly review it. But don't go whole hog on that and go over stuff that you already know when you could be studying something that you aren't as comfortable with. So, as I said here, draw up a schedule based on what you know are your strengths and weaknesses, and allow a little time at the end to go back and review the weak areas again. Even though you spent more time on them anyway, if you're still feeling uncomfortable about it, go back and review them again. And the other thing is, stick to the schedule. Do not say, I allowed X number of weeks for something or the other, and I'm just not quite through. I'm going to take a little time off something or the other. You've got to pace yourself and stick to the schedule. Practice questions. Okay, the RISE exam is a very good way to, and as I think most of you know now, there is a correlation between your performance on the RISE exam and your performance on the board exam, as one would expect and hope, certainly. There are a lot of pathology question books out there, and a lot of them have on the cover questions from the board exam. All right, well, I'm reasonably confident that they're not really questions from the board exam. But how many different ways can you ask, what is the predominant characteristic of such and such a tumor? Or how many different slides that are characteristic of a fibroadenoma can you put up for somebody to look at? It's not from the board exam, but it's probably very similar to what's on the board exam. And there's only so many different ways you can ask most of these questions. So I think review books are good. And as I always say, don't just most of the review books will not only tell you what the correct answer is, but they'll explain why the wrong answers are wrong. So don't just read, oh, I got that right, and go on. Read about why the wrong answers are wrong, because that can help you. You'd be surprised how much you can learn and take in while you're doing something like that. And then we often get calls that say, which book do you take your questions out of for the exam? Not that simple. But, in all honesty, probably the best book for general path is Robbins. The first 10 chapters of Robbins are excellent reviews of general pathology. And the best overall CP book is probably Henry. But, it may be that, I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me go back here to Surge Path and Cytopath. I didn't list a book for. And that's because, A, you really can't read all of a surgical pathology book or all of a cytopathology book while you're studying for the boards. You have to use these as reference. You can't just, read a section about something, and the section may be really good in Rosai on one thing, and it may be much better in something else on something in another book, based upon how you read and how the book reads to you. If you've got a Surge Path book that for some reason you just find is incredibly hard to get through, don't use that to study from. Go find one that you can read a little easier. They've basically all got the same stuff in them. And it's just a matter of which book you find easiest to use, because you cannot sit down and read through the whole book and expect to remember anything. And the same is true for Cytopath. And the same is true for Henry, really. You cannot sit down and just read through Henry. You could, but you fall asleep in about 10 or 15 minutes and wake up hours later and half your study time would be gone. But it's a very good book you could read little sections of it. If you're working on, I would never recommend sit down and read through the blood bank section of Henry. But if you're trying to read about delayed transfusion reactions and you're trying to remember whether it's the KID or the KEL that's the most common one that causes such and such, go back and read about that in Henry. You don't have to have a blood bank textbook to read that in. Most of the individual laboratory textbooks for microbiology and so forth and so on are far more detailed than what you're going to need to know for this exam. And I think that's one of the reasons why I say that, if you use Henry to guide your reading while you're on a rotation and you read through those sections, then you shouldn't need to have to try and go back and try to read through the whole book again while you're studying for the exam. Just go back and brush up on the areas that you are a little uncertain about. It's a very good reference. I haven't looked at the DVD, which I'm sure there is one up by now, but it's probably good too. But there may be a few things you want to look up in a blood bank text or a microtext, but there's not going to be much. And again, if you find a CP book or if you find a little synopsis of something or the other that you can read that, but Henry puts you to sleep, then read what you can read. Don't try to read something that you're not going to make it through. So now we get to the review course. Okay. I have mixed feelings about review courses, as you can probably tell from what's on this slide. I think the main thing they do is cost you more money, and everybody always complains to me about how much the PATH exam costs, so I'm not sure why you want to spend more money on a review course. But actually, the PATH exam is about in the middle of the board exam fees. If you're trying to figure out how much the exams cost, make sure that you go and look at not just the written exam, but the ones that have oral exams, because a lot of the ones that look really cheap to start with have an oral exam that costs a whole lot more. But anyway, we're about in the middle. And board review courses are expensive, you know. There is a subset of people for whom they are very helpful. And I think the problem with review courses is everybody feels obligated to take one. Because you think, if I don't pass this exam and I didn't take that review course, I'm going to be so mad at myself. I think that review courses probably teach you very little. I think that it's a rare person who could say that they learned something in a review course that they'd never heard before, that it just suddenly became clear or whatever. It's possible, but I think it's not likely. What they do, however, is they will organize your time for you. If you're somebody who can't make that schedule and stick to it, if you have no idea how to organize your time, it will help you do that. And it will help you identify areas of weakness if you're unable to do that for yourself. I think most of you, if I went around this room and asked you, which I won't do, okay? But if I did, you could probably tell me what areas you're pretty comfortable with and which ones you're not. You know that. You don't need a review course to tell you that. So, you know, plus minus. Psychologically, I think you probably get a lift out of going to a review course. You think you're really doing something defined and specific that's helping you. But I really don't know that that's the case. The ASCP has a very good review course. Osler runs a course. There's a ton of review courses. But, you know, I certainly wouldn't tell you they're a total waste of time because they're not. But I don't know that what most people get out of them justifies the expense, not only of the course itself, but the travel to the course and the hotel bills and the meals and all that other kind of stuff. But, you know, that's sort of up to you. That's one of those things that I can't tell you about. It's like when I taught in medical school and people wanted to take the Kaplan course to review for the USMLE, you know, I said the same thing. It's a lot of money. It's probably not going to help you that much. If it makes you feel that much better, go ahead. But, you know, you can do the same thing yourself. If you're disciplined, that's the distinction. Now, I've only taken a little over half of my time here, so I wanted to leave some time for questions, which I may or may not be able to answer. I'll give you that right off the top of my head. I hope this has been a little bit helpful. As I said, it's very difficult for me to tell you how to study. I don't know what works for you. I know what works for me. I mean, you know, the other thing which I debated about whether to say or not, but I finally decided today that I would go ahead and say it, is that, you know, if there's an area that you find particularly hard, and it's an area that by looking at, you probably guess, you know, how many questions can there be on the exam on that? Skip it. You know, don't spend hours and hours and hours trying to hammer something into your head that you know you're not ever going to get anyway. You know, how many questions can there be on that? All right? Now, you know, you have to use the time that you have to make the most of your own strengths and to alleviate as much of your weaknesses as possible. You're never going to alleviate all of them. There are some things that you just can't know. You know, it's like in histopathology, I finally got to the point where, for some reason or another, I could not then and cannot now. I always have a hard time recognizing pituitary under the microscope. And it finally got to the point where when I put something under the microscope and I'd look at it and go, what the hell is that? I decided it must be pituitary. Because that was the only thing that I did that with. You know, the rest of them I'd have some kind of idea what was going on. I don't know why I could not recognize pituitary. But most of the time I was right. You know, it was pituitary, but I couldn't figure out what it was. So, you know, everybody's got their own little quirks, and you've got to work with those. So what questions do you have? Okay.
Our institution does not offer lab management rotation.
Okay.
We get a few random lectures, but judging from the RISE test exams that I almost never get right,
Okay.
it's not really the area that we question
Right.
on.
Okay.
So is there a source? I don't know what to read for the lab management.
Okay, the question, if you couldn't hear it, has to do with lab management, because a lot of places don't necessarily have a lab management rotation. Again, no, I wouldn't skip it. That's too important to skip, because that's something, you know, like it or not, no matter what you end up doing, you're going to be doing some of that. You can't get away from that. And I think that there are actually some books that are supposed to be coming out in the next year or so that are supposed to be, the next few months actually, they're supposed to be pretty good. But, and I've seen a couple of them. I think ASCP may even be publishing one of them. But what I would suggest in terms of laboratory management, and again it involves being in the lab, sit down with the supervisor and look at the quality control, okay? Sit down with the person who reviews the CAP proficiency testing results, see what they're looking at. Try and understand what CLIA regulation that's based on. You know, a lot of laboratory management is actually sort of common sense if you think about it and you try and think about what the purpose of the management is, which is to make the most you can with limited resources. And to provide the best data to the most people for the least amount of money, but you've got to try and prioritize that. Best data is the key. You know, it can't always be done for no money, which hospital administrators have a hard time understanding. But I think what you really have to do with that, again, is if you see it, it makes a lot more sense. So you should ask to spend some time. Some hospitals have a quality manager as part of their laboratory supervisory staff. And if so, spend some time with that person. But otherwise, you know, sit down and look at the QC for something and ask them to show you an example of when they found a problem and what they did to fix it. I think, again, you have to see it. You can't just read it, and you can't really just listen to it. So lectures are fine, but they're not going to substitute for actually having participated in some of that. Other questions? Okay.
2 questions. Versus, you about electron microscopy and conventional versus liquid-based and the AP exam?
Okay. You know, the hearing is the first thing to go, so you're going to, can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, sorry. Could you repeat what you said about the electron microscopy?
Okay, sure. And the conventional PAPs. Okay, as sure as I say we never do something, then somebody will pick a question on the next exam and I'll get shot by. But as a general rule, the EM that you would be required to look at on the AP exam would be medical renal EM, okay? We generally, I don't think we put any tumor EM on the exam in a long time. You know, we don't put, is this a desmosome or something on the exam anymore. It's basically medical renal and, you know, where you see the deposits and what the sorts of things that you would see for that. And again, I would not swear to you that we'll never have a pap smear on the exam before if we have a particularly wonderful pap smear that has great herpes or something in it, all right. But for the most part, the GYN cytology questions are going to be what we call liquid-based, which is the ThinPrep or the SurePrep or one of those things, SurePath, one of those deals, not the pap smears so much, okay?
And then the other thing is, on one of the AP breakdown slides, under the categories, did you have neuropath or orthopath?
Well, that would be because that would probably be less than 7 to 9% of the exams. I didn't put every single area up there. Yeah, each of those would be like 7 to 9% of the 94% or whatever. So the things that end up being only 2 or 3 or 4%, I didn't even put on there. So, you know, if you can't do bone, then, you know, you might be able to get by without it if you're really good in something else. Okay, next question. Okay, there's a paper that's going to be out. If it's not in the, I can't remember if it's in the last. It's in the last one. Is it in the last AJCP or is it going to be? If you,
Our program director gave us this paper about the correlation
Right. Right. I think it just came out in AJCP, and it's a very good correlation between what happened was that Dr. Render looked at the scores of people who, senior level people who took the exams and in the same year that they took the RISE or the next year, and looked at the correlations. And it was very good. And then he went back and generally speaking, the pattern was sort of the same. If you're in the lower quartile or lower half in your sophomore or junior year, that does predict that you're probably still going to be in the lower half of your senior year, and that doesn't do as well on the board as if you're in the upper percentile. I can't remember exactly what it is, but go back and look at the paper, and that should answer your question. It's by Dr. Render, and it's in AJCP. Next question. Right. Okay. No. Yeah, I understand. The first question was how often do we update the item bank, and the second one is if we delete questions from the item bank, why don't we make those available to people to study, in essence, right? Pretty much got it. All right. Updating the item bank is actually sort of an ongoing issue, but it's very difficult. We have something like 35,000 questions in the item bank, and each committee tries to go through the old questions as a part of their meetings, but you can't get through all of the old questions at each meeting. So we try and go back and update on an ongoing basis. If there's a major change in terminology or something, then we try and go through and do like searches for the words and change them. We don't always find every single one of them, and every once in a while somebody will complain about using outdated terminology. But we try and do that on a very regular basis. Microbiology changes the name of organisms about every other year, so it's really hard to keep up with the current name for all the microorganisms. But, for example, what we'll usually do if that changes is we'll have the old name in parentheses and then the new name for a while. So we try and update it all the time. Questions that we actually delete, a question gets deleted either because it's too easy and everybody gets it right, or it's too hard. And what we try to do for most questions, rather than delete them, is to try and rework them and see if we can make the easy question a little harder or make a hard question a little easier. That doesn't always work. So some of the questions that may be relatively easy may get moved into the MOC pile, and you don't want me to delete those because you're going to be looking at those later, okay? So we try to keep a certain perspective there. For the ones that are too hard, we could release the really very easy ones. I don't know that it would do you a lot of good to look at either the really easy ones or the really hard ones, and those are the ones that tend to get deleted. So that's really why we don't put them out, because if it's that easy, you know it anyway, and if it's that hard, you're not going to get asked it. We basically delete questions from the exam if it becomes apparent that, looking at the percent results, that this is just something that's not taught, or it was a bad question or something. So I'm not sure the ones we delete would help you very much. Question? Just one.
How soon, like something's not in the literature, would that show up into your question? For instance, like varicella leukemia now, PRAF is a big deal with that.
Usually, it needs to be in a textbook. Okay. If it's come into a textbook or a search path book, then it's okay. But a paper we won't use. Question. Right. Well, the computer, what happens is that once we do wait till everybody's taken in a group, okay, and we send all those results in, and then we get an item analysis back, which takes usually 1 to 2 weeks. And in that item analysis, we have every question and how many people got it right and which choices they picked. And so we go through all of that, and we look at it and we say, okay, you know, this one is a bad question, we have to throw it out. So that takes a little while. Sometimes that can be done fairly quickly if it's something that I feel like I need to consult somebody else on, then, you know, that can take a little more time. And then, so we send that back then, and they throw out those questions, and then they come back with another report, which we look at and we say, okay, well, that looks like that's reasonable and it makes sense. And frankly, some of the delay beyond about 3 weeks or so relates to trying to get the data but from the psychometrician system into our computer system, which is done by somebody else, and getting that data, making sure that that gets transported right, because every now and then we'll look and say, ooh, they said that person passed and they didn't. And so we have to go over all of that to try. So we're not at a point yet where we can just let it go. If we could do that, then it wouldn't take nearly as long. But we really go over everything to try and make sure that we eliminate as much error as possible. Other questions? Okay.
So different programs use
There's more than one version of the exam. Everybody doesn't take the same version, but they're equated statistically. Okay, so somebody from a different program may have taken a different version of the exam than you did, but they're statistically equated. And there's more than one form of the exam. The forms are equated statistically for the same year, and then the tests are equated from one year to the next. So you can't say that people did better on this exam this year because it was an easier test. If the test is easier, then you end up having to answer more questions right to get to the same point. So everything is statistically equated, but everybody does not have the same exam. Okay. And I think that does it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Okay, come up and ask me. It's all scaled. Right.
And this constitutes a big amount of the AP?
It's a fair amount of AP.
So it's more than 9%?
I think we put breast and something else together there. Let me go back and see what I said. I don't even remember. Okay?
I thought it was a separate line.
It may be a separate line. If it wasn't, it's probably 7 to 9% by itself. It is very common and it's very important, so it does have a lot of...
okay.
That's probably right.
So here. So
Yeah.
that's only so it's
breast
more
is-
than
it's-
9%?
No, actually, this is supposed to come up here. I don't think there's
okay.
anything that's more than 7 to 9%. So it would be as much as these others.
Okay.
Okay. Sure.